So yeah, when you look at these two big paintings of the sausages there, they're one of the things I was trying to do with this body of work is to see like how much you can get with like one object that you sort of like recycle through like various moves as you paint it. So like literally in a way like slicing apart the sausage. So you can see one tiny painting there with like slices of sausages. So there's this representation element, but then there's also ways in which this object was taken apart into its like pictorial elements rather than like, you know, so it's not a recognizable slice anymore, but it just becomes like a stripe of textured paint, a stripe of like brown paint. Some of the works are just squiggles. So, but they always come back to this one image of the sausage, which started this body of work. And it was kind of exciting to like have this image, this one motif, and trying to figure out like how many different kinds of ways I could paint it in and still have it be kind of connected. So you can see the ovals at the back. Those are essentially what I imagine to be the slices from these big paintings. So they became like standalone bits of meat, and they read more as meat in the context of the show rather than if they were outside of the context of this exhibition. There's one, I don't really ever make sculptures, but I figured this would be a good opportunity. So I made this piece that's essentially like a movable sculpture with a painted top and ostrich eggshells. So they're real eggs, but from ostriches. And I thought of it as a kind of like, called a combo because it's a combination of sculpture and painting, of eggs and meat. And I thought of Rauschenberg's combo sculptures a little bit as I was making that. And, you know, it's not like, I don't really do sculpture, but it was kind of a fun way to like go into that. Yeah, so like this body of work, it's larger than what you see here, but I was working on it for about 2 years, like trying to make various versions of these sausage paintings. And eventually, like I just became tired and wanted to paint other things. But during that time, it was kind of exciting to try and figure out like how much freedom you can get out of like a very limited palette, really like limited in terms of like color choices, in terms of motif, in terms of like shapes and forms. And there was something really liberating about it, like to be like, okay, what am I going to paint today? I'm going to paint some kind of a sausage painting. And yeah, so what I'm going to do today, whenever I start doing it, is I'm going to read a poem, and I'm not a poem, it's not a poem, I'm not a poet, it's not a poem by me. So I was kind of, when I saw that I'm doing a poetry reading, I thought, cool, I have an idea for that. I'm going to read this poem by a Turkish poet called Nazım Hikmet, who was born in 1902 in Thessaloniki, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire, but is in Greece today. So he was born in 1902. He was a writer, a poet who studied in Moscow for a little bit, spent quite a bit of time of his life in various Turkish prisons. The poem that I'm going to read to you was actually written in a Turkish prison in 1948. And I think he was in prison for a total of 10 years at various moments of his life. And a few years after this poem was written, he had to leave the country and emigrated to the Soviet Union and died there in the early 60s. And his grave is still there. So he was stripped of his Turkish citizenship and essentially like was forced to flee or emigrate the country because of his political leanings, which were fairly to the left. Interestingly though, despite all his like, various tensions and problems with the government and his like run-ins with the authorities there, he's a very, very popular poet in Turkey, has been throughout his life, and was essentially like he after his death, his citizenship was given back to him. His honor was kind of restored, so to say. His grave is still in Moscow, and this poem, it's called Unliving, and it's essentially like a sort of like manual for how to live when things are going kind of badly. And he was writing it while he was in prison. Yeah, so, it was written in 1948, but thinking of it from the context of today, it seems very sort of like, it makes a lot of sense, and it resonates quite interestingly. So kind of like eerily so. And then the other text that I'm going to read to you is an essay by John Berger that really was like, I read it and then like it just gave me the idea for this body of work. And it'll be very obvious what the connection is once I start reading it. So keep talking or just start reading, or because there are a few people who texted me, said that they're on their way.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I'm interesting what you said about trying to get as much sort of breadth out of the idea of the sausage. Why did you choose the sausage in particular? Like, I know it's an innocuous object, but is there any particular connection for you? It was
an object that you could paint and make it recognizable fairly easily. Part of the answer to that question is this essay, but also just visually, what was interesting about this object was that you can paint it and make it look like the thing it is fairly easily. And at the same time, once you've done that, you can take it apart and cut it into its components, because like in real life, you cut apart a sausage, you sort of like pack it together and it becomes like this thing, and then you cut it apart and you just, so it was really like the recognizability of it and the things you can do with it, both like as a painter, but also just in real life. I mean, there's also something about it that's a little bit gross, like that you just put all these different kinds of meat together and then you call it's a sausage. And I think that's
like it's a composite object.
Yeah. And then when you paint it, there's something really messy about the act of painting as well. And that messiness is, I thought that there was a real sort of resonance there between the act of like pumping this like skin full of like bits of meat, or like, putting all of that onto a painted surface. The other thing that I also thought was kind of fun with painting it was that I could choose between areas of like really heavy texture and heavy impasto, and other areas of really smooth transitions, and sort of contrast those in the same painting. Mainly these big ones here. So it was like, I think I'm not on camera. So despite the sense that it seems quite limiting, it was actually quite liberating, like to be able to do all these things with limited means. And I think that's sort of like one of the weird, odd things about art making, is that when you give yourself, like say when you have everything at your disposal, that becomes kind of paralyzing. But then when you impose limitations on yourself, that can become liberating. And for me, that seems a little counterintuitive, but in this body of work, I felt like it was really, that's really how it worked. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know your other paintings, so I didn't know if it was a totally new diet to be so gestural. And then I also wonder, sort of a bad pun, but Francis Bacon.
Yeah.
His work seems to be sort of present, but beyond just puns.
Yeah, I really like his work a lot. I have to say, like, it's sort of his work is obviously really dark, and when you see interviews with him, and I'm thinking particularly, I've been reading this collection of interviews with David Silvestri that he did, and he doesn't seem to be like a particularly, like, you can sense that he was troubled. You can sense that like there was a lot in his life that like maybe didn't go super well, or maybe it was just personality. I don't know what it was, but there's something about the work that, to me, as much as I love it as painting, the worldview that has sort of gone into it, I find, to me, in this current moment, like I find it very difficult to deal with that kind of thing. And this body work is also older, like his presence was sort of like more there when I was painting these works. But I think there's something about that particular darkness in his works that I find right now is just a little hard to take. And it's sort of like, I know this sounds a little sort of like vague, but like, you know, different artists do different things for you at different times. Right now, I find him a little difficult just because the last 2 years have been so rough, and you know, it's not, it isn't what I look for in art right now.
But maybe the gesture, because he's got such movement and gesture. And I
Yeah.
feel like is that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, he talks about that a lot, right? In his like, so the way, one of the things that he does, the way he paints is he paints on the back of the, like he will gesso one side, but he will paint on the ungessoed side. So like when you apply the paint, it like soaks into the fabric of the canvas like right away, and in a way that makes it very hard to fix things. So he was a big time gambler, right? And what he was interested in was like trying it once, and if it works, then it was great luck, and if it doesn't work, then it's just garbage. So he destroyed a lot of work when he felt like his movement and gestures and the way he threw on paint didn't work right away. And that came from his like idea of like the connection between like the sort of randomness of gesture and how sometimes you're really lucky and it ends up being in the perfect spot, and other times it just doesn't work at all. And you know, that's like how it works in gambling. And he actually, one of the reasons why he started to paint on the backs of his canvases was that he was in, I think it was in Monaco, he gambled away all his money and he couldn't afford any more art materials. So he just like painted on the backs of his paintings, and then it became like his thing. I talked to a person who, when I was living in the UK, who as one of her jobs, like was trying to fix one of his paintings, and they're really hard to repair just because the texture of the canvas keeps pulling out the oil from the paint, like it just keeps doing it, and the paint becomes very brittle. So he really just didn't really care at all about longevity. Like it was just not his problem. You know, he's like, other people are going to take care of it. But yeah, I mean, certainly he's been throughout my creative development a strong influence and a very present influence. Just right now, he's a little difficult for me to look at. What about Richard? Oh. No, I actually don't eat meat myself. I'm a vegetarian.
That's so good. I was wondering that. I am too, and I wasn't somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's about, you know, painting is about make believe, right?
Oh, 5 minutes. Okay,
5 minutes?
we have 5 minutes, 5 more minutes before the.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I could also just read the poem, and then there's the text that.
Yeah.
Should I do that?
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
And we've got one.
Because the poem is not really related to this body of work. It's more like, I read it sort of like midway through the pandemic, and I was like, oh, this is kind of helpful. So maybe you'll enjoy it. Maybe it'll be helpful. Maybe not. I don't know. But so it's by Nazim Hikmet. And should I sit? I can stand. Right?
Whichever. Yeah, you can stand if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a poem that's called Unliving. It's a poem in 3 parts. Yeah, and essentially it's a manual for what to do when things go badly. Also, I've lost all my social grace in the last 2 years, so I apologize for my awkwardness. Living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness, like a squirrel, for example. I mean, without looking for something beyond and above living. I mean, living must be your whole occupation. Living is no laughing matter. You must take it seriously, so much so and to such a degree that, for example, your hands tied behind your back to the wall, or else in the laboratory in your white coat and safety glasses, you can die for people, even for people whose faces you've never seen, even though you know living is the most real, the most beautiful thing. I mean, you must take living so seriously that even at 70, for example, you'll plant olive trees, and not for your children either. But because although you fear death, you don't believe it. Because living, I mean, means heavier. Part 2. Let's say we're seriously ill, need surgery, which is to say we might not get up from the white table. Even though it's impossible not to feel sad about going a little too soon, we'll still laugh at the jokes being told. We'll look out the window to see if it's raining, or still wait anxiously for the latest newscast. Let's say we're at the front for something worth fighting for, say. There, in the first offensive, on that very day, we might fall on our face, dead. We'll notice with a curious anger, but we'll still worry ourselves to death about the outcome of the war, which could last years. Let's say we're imprisoned and close to 50, and we have 18 more years, say, before the iron doors will open. We'll still live with the outside, with its peoples and animals, struggle and wind. I mean, with the outside beyond the walls. I mean, however and wherever we are, we must live as if we will never die. Part 3. This earth will grow cold, a star among stars, and one of the smallest. A gilded mote on blue velvet. I mean this, our great earth. This earth will grow cold one day. Not like a block of ice or a dead cloud even, but like an empty walnut, it will roll along in pitch black space. You must grieve for this right now. You have to feel the sorrow now, for the world must be loved this much if you're going to say, I lived. 1948, this one was written, and obviously resonates in a lot of ways. Like with, yeah, and it's like, he was writing that in a prison, and he'd been in prison for like almost 10 years at the time. And I think it's a kind of, he's probably a good person to take advice from for years in prison at that point when he wrote this. What did you think of this poem?
Very hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
Just after World War II as well, so there would have been a lot of despair around, even outside of the prison.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like he's projecting a lot of hope.
I was just going to say 1984 was written in 1948, so that's the opposite.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
What was he in prison for? Was he a political prisoner?
For being leftist, for writing essays and stories and poetry that was leftist and rabble-rouser, basically. Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, like his work is very obviously political, but it's also just poetry for poetry's sake. Like there's this really terrible joke in Turkey that it really says a lot about how things were or are for writers there. There's one writer who said that prison is the school of Turkish writers, and I think that there's definitely something to that. But in this joke, there's this inmate in a prison who goes to the prison warden and says, I really want to read a book. I mean, it must be possible to read a book in a Turkish prison. And prison guard's like, okay, let me make a few calls with my superiors. So he goes away and makes a few calls and comes back and says, okay, I'm sorry, but like, you can't have a book in a Turkish prison. It's just not possible. But I've got some good news for you. The person across from me is an author. So and it's really like so many good Turkish writers have either been to prison or have been like, had to go to court and like narrowly avoided prison. So yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, it's a bad joke, but it really like says something about the conditions there. Well,
Very, let me see. Yeah, okay. I'd say, let me look outside for special guests.
So that was a poetry part of the poetry reading.
Mary better come up with some pretty great questions. Would anyone like sparkling water while we wait?
I mean, I'm also okay with just reading maybe. So should I just read the essay then?
Keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Poem again? Oh, okay.
When you get around to it, if somebody else hasn't heard it that's coming.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Heard to hear it again.
All right. So the next thing I'm going to read to you, and the connection of the body of work will be very, very obvious. It's from John Berger. It's from 1972, and it was written. And it's called On the Banks of the Sava. Sava is a river. And it's not very long. About 20 miles southwest of Belgrade, there's a small town called Obrenovac. The bus stops opposite the post office. There's a decorative flower bed with grass growing in it instead of flowers. 4 men sit on the edge of it, leaning forward with their elbows on their knees, talking. Behind them is a small but well-stocked supermarket. Other shops in the main street are less like those of a consumer society. There's an ironmonger's with homemade stovepipes in the window. There are 4 or 5 tailor shops with lengths of material for men's suits and handmade sačkađe, the Serbian dented cap for men in their windows. A hairdresser, a baker with several different kinds of bread, including ring-shaped, seed-covered, jevreki, and various sorts of strudels. Then a butcher with no meat in the window, but with carcasses hanging at the back of the shop. In Russian cities, the food displayed in shop windows often consists of painted wooden bottles, wooden chops, chickens, eggs. From a distance, they sometimes look more convincing than real food because their colors are unusually vivid and distinct. The wooden meat is either lean, red, or fat, cream-colored. There was a painter from Georgia towards the end of the last century called Pirozmanishvili, who spent most of his life going from one tavern in Tiflis to another, painting inn signs. Many of them were of food. I've never seen paintings more expressive of hunger, or rather of the dreams provoked by hunger. Tabletops like the earth, and on them cheeses and joints of meats like huge buildings. Even the women he painted looked edible, like Easter cakes. In Pirozmanishvili's work, the Russian tradition of painting wooden models of food for shop windows found its only genius and master. Why is it that the real lamb hanging at the back of the butcher shop in Obrenović unexpectedly, without premeditation, reminds me of his painting? Further along the street, there is a bookshop in which most of the books have the appearance of old school textbooks. I know already that when the children come out of school for lunch, they will be wearing black overalls trimmed with white stitching. But even if I ignored the shop windows and the children, and if I walked, as I often do, head down looking at my feet, I would still know which part of Europe I was in. The surface of the road is poor, and where it is metalled, the edges are rough and unfinished. This much, however, might be true of parts of France. It is the strength with which the grass grows, pushing up lean and stocky wherever there is a gap or crack. Is it the strength with which the grass grows, pushing up lean and stocky wherever there is a gap or crack that makes it so Slav? Is there something quintessential in the yellowy grass stalks and that dusty gray tar, which may at any moment break into cobbles or fade away into earth? It is necessary to insist that there is nothing exotic in such questions. The answers are literally part of the substratum of real, in no way romantic events. For example, that dusty, tarry gray is the color at the bottom of the tram lines in Prague when it is dry and the sun catches in a muted acetylene blue on the uppermost surface of the rails. I'll just stop for a moment. We're just one page into a 5-page essay. So haven't missed too much. So I'll just repeat the last sentence. It is necessary to insist that there's nothing exotic in such questions. Your answers are literally part of the substratum of real, in no way romantic events. For example, that dusty, tarry gray is the color at the bottom of the tram lines in Prague when it is dry and the sun catches in a muted acetylene blue on the uppermost surface of the rails. Or is the characteristic quality of the road more to do with the relative thinness of its surface? Is it that it has never been embedded in the earth, but only laid on its surface? Is it that the road wears like a cloth rather than a solid structure? Either side of the main street, the houses are low. You can almost touch their roofs. They have double windows with a space the width of the walls between the panes. In the space in one window, there is a pot of geraniums and behind them coarse lace curtains. The other window is slightly dusty. To look through the glass with the transparent nap of dust at the deep red flowers in the shade and then through the lace, the color string tied around parcels, into the brownish darkness of the room beyond is to rediscover something of one's childhood. Is this the result of stories read, or does its childishness derive from the scale of the window and house? Occasionally along the street pass buses, cars, open lorries, and horses hauling four-wheeled wooden carts like open-ended, very elongated cradles. The drivers, reins in hand, sit rounded and hunched up, as dogmatically immobile against the movement of the cart as stone piers against the movement of a river. There are also cyclists on tall black bicycles with the wheels far apart, so that the cyclist gives the impression of hurriedly following the front wheel instead of bearing down upon it. At right angles to the main street are a number of rough roads which lead for half a mile or more towards the fields and woods and wasteland which surrounds the town. These are access roads to the house. These are access roads to the houses on either side of them. Some of these houses are like suburban bungalows. Others are old, very small cottages which contain no more than one room. A fair number have television aerials on their roofs, and at the same time, wells in their gardens or courtyards for water. It is these gardens and yards which fascinate me and which constitute the most striking visual element. In some, there are flower beds of roses, and on the grass between them, chickens and ducks. There are also cherry trees and pigs. On the outside of the fence, along the borders of the road, there's a goat chained to a stake and two kids who butt each other, standing on their hind legs like beasts rampant in a heraldry that never existed here. In these gardens and yards, the distinction between the two terms is that a garden is private, whereas a yard is a space onto which 2 or 3 houses give. There are also tables, jugs, or pails of water, benches, chairs, creepers to give shade, tall grass, bare earth to be dampened in the summer so that it does not become too dusty, vegetables, acacia trees, and ritual space. These gardens and yards are like bodies accepted for what they are without pretense. They are neither neglected nor, in a strict sense, cultivated. Yet, such a description imputes a moral awareness that is irrelevant. A strange, undemonstrative equality has been established here between nature and tenant. They are neither oppressive nor sordid. They suggest neither ambition nor despair. They are simply and consistently inhabited, like rooms built on the earth. You measure them according to a human time scale. They're not immediate like herbaceous borders, nor are they timeless like forests. Everything in them is a little overgrown, and everything is intentional. And this is evident without a person being in sight or a story being told, merely through the disposition of what is visible within them. The town is not far from the banks of the Sava. The Sava rises in the Julian Alps and joins the Danube at Belgrade, where the confluence of the two large rivers, with its considerable expanse of shining water, affects the light above the city, so that sometimes you have the impression, looking up a street, that over the brow of its hill there will be the sea. Here the river is strong, wide, muddy gray colored and opaque, though bright like the sky because it is fast flowing. If one must use the misleading metaphor of a river to describe the nature of time, this is the kind of river one should visualize. It has weight, and this weight is a reminder of the scale of the landmass to which everything on its bank belongs. It is a river that ultimately celebrates not water, but land. At the end of the road, which leads to it from the outskirts of Obrenovac, there is a cafe where they grill the river fish and serve them with cabbage salad. For some way, the road back to Belgrade runs beside the Sava. The bus stops at each village, usually outside the cafe if there is one, if not, where a few men are sitting on cases and boxes talking, with a bottle of beer between their feet. The bus radio is loud, songs not unlike certain Greek ones. As the bus bowls along, the seats squeak and the windows rattle. If there's a pothole, they clatter. And all these sounds are somehow accommodated by the music. People quite far away from the road look up at the approach of the bus because they hear the notes and the voice it is bringing nearer and then carrying away into the distance. Why am I so conscious of the progress of these sounds through the landscape, along the road, down the river? It isn't that everything else is quiet. It isn't because everyone looks up as we pass. It is, I think, because everything I can see out the window suggests an expanse, a continuity which forces me to be aware of, to trace the length of our short, noisy ride over it. But what is it that suggests this almost endless continuity? The light in the sky, the air, the specific changes of color caused by distance here. Perhaps these play a part, but principally I think it is because no event in the landscape, no hill, no tree, no building is so striking that it creates a natural force, focal center to which everything else becomes subservient. Each event passes your eye on to another, and then one to another, and another, and another, so that there's no reason to suppose that the sequence need ever stop. In Western European terms, the opposite of romantic is classic. This landscape, however, is the true antithesis of the romantic landscape. The romantic is always at the edge, at the end of the possible. It proposes the ultimate, either sublimely or terribly. It is based on hierarchy, whereas here, between the events of the landscape, there's a restrained egalitarianism similar to that which was evident in the gardens between the human and the natural. It is the normalcy of this landscape which makes it seem boundless. In the National Gallery at Belgrade, there's not a single painting which bears witness to any of these quintessential qualities, nor can I think of many paintings elsewhere that do so. It is not a landscape which lends itself to representational painting, but rather to film because it moves, or to embroidery and decoration because they ignore the difference between near and far. It is the landscape, however, evident behind the experience, expressed in a great deal of Slav poetry. But one must be clear about what one is looking for. There's nothing Arcadian or innocent or eternal or reassuring about its qualities. Such landscape encourages a passionate, not quietist recognition of transience. Yes. So yeah, I mean, I think the beginning with the Russian painter and his food displays, you missed that part. So he refers to this one painter who's from Georgia, the country Georgia, who became known for painting. That he proposes there that they're not really reminiscent of hunger, but of the dreams provoked by hunger. That's, for me, is a really beautiful line. And so I read this essay, and shortly after I started painting this body of work and these paintings. And yeah, so it's kind of odd also reading this essay with a few years having passed in between them. Yeah, maybe I'll just stop talking here now and take comments or questions or anything what did you think of the essay?
Found it quite transporting, actually, very visual.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like I was traveling through it.
It's really easy to imagine those crappy roads. Isn't
Yeah,
it?
I can almost smell it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How old is this body of work?
I started it in 2013 and worked on it for I think like 3 years or so. And this is not the whole body of work, but like I'd say for about 2 to 3 years, I was painting mostly sausage related paintings.
And you mentioned that you have children. Was this before you had your children?
Yes, it was before I had kids.
So this was chaotic.
Oh, no.
It might have happened on when you were having. So I just find it interesting to understand after I've seen an exhibition, what was going on in the artist's life at the time when they made the work. I mean,
Yeah.
other than the choices they make intellectually,
Yeah.
or what the work's supposed to be, I think there's often something that's going on a really unconscious level.
Yeah.
So it's always good to know what's going on in a person's life
Yeah.
at the time of creation.
Well, what had happened at the time was I had just moved to Winnipeg, and typically when I relocate like that, you pack up your studio, you find a new studio, you unpack, and like just that alone, need more new materials and new surfaces. You start again, like it's a sort of like natural cutoff point, and it usually triggers new body of work. I think I remember feeling rather uninspired at the beginning there, like not knowing what I was going to paint. And the works that I was doing before were quite different in terms of like color palette and much less muted, much more like, I was mentioning earlier, this idea of like limitations can be freeing. And I think before that, I just tried to not have limitations, and it was weirdly difficult to try to make paintings with the sense that I can do whatever I want. But then like as soon as I gave myself these limitations, it became very liberating. And that was a really odd, it was a very different mindset or to impose on myself, or like to adopt going to the studio. Very useful.
And you have walls to push against rather than just reaching out.
Yeah, it was like really helpful actually. Less paralyzing. I mean, of course, that can become its own prison after a couple of years, right? Like and I think that's when I stopped, when it became too easy to make these paintings and less exciting. But while it lasted, it was really fun.
I guess the metaphor for the water and the land edge is that sort of playing that idea of limits. And I started seeing the river as a big sausage. A little fish inside. But it's just like, I think it's because I was searching.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea like how he describes the landscape, that like it's not sublime, it's just kind of like ongoing, like it's sort of like really normal. It's like not wild, but also not cultivated. Like that sort of like in between is kind of like, it's really neat, like so in a way, when I think like landscape painting, like one of the things I think of is like Caspar David Friedrich and Romanticism and these like sublime landscapes. And I really like those paintings, but there's also something so like, that's not what he's talking about, right? Yeah, I mean, the idea of like the edges and borders are always a thing in painting, right? Like there's always something awkward about edges and borders and something unresolved that like, if you look at these paintings, like the edges always feel awkward, right? Like the areas between the thick paint and the thin paint, but also like the edge of the sausage in the background, like it's just, like it always feels awkward in painting. And I mean, he's, for him, it's like the edges of the landscape. I think maybe there is a bit of a resonance there. I don't know. It's something that I would need to think about
Well, I
a
was
bit more.
just wondering about that in reference to the exhibition title as well, that because obviously at the beginning when you're talking about the inspiration behind it, a lot to do with color and sort of texture, but also you are making some degree commentary on the commodification of the art market, so that sort of edge and border of the freedom you have while painting versus the sort of.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that title is quite open, right? I mean, on the one hand, you buy meat at a market, there's a meat market, there's an art market, like it's always about, I think that's for sure it is there. But I mean, really like what I'm most interested in is to like, when you're making a painting, to try and make it a good painting. And there's a particular like satisfaction that comes from feeling like it's worked out well. When you finish a painting, I mean, I don't want to like I think that commentary is probably still there. I just don't want to overstress it.
No, yeah, but I guess it might finish a question, but is there no, I mean it's just trailing off, but because there's sort of this playfulness, this satirical side here, where you're sort of commenting on, I guess, that idea of what is good art or isn't good art, and you're really about your art and what felt good and completing it. Is that was that, I guess, consciously part of developing this?
Yeah, so I'm here referring in particular to this. This is definitely is a comment, right? Like it's the comment beside the painting, literally, right? So what it is it's a diagram from a book that I picked up. It's Valley Village of Salvation Army, like for like 50 cents or so, and it was techniques of drawing, and he was trying to explain in this book what makes a good composition. And I've taught in art schools, I have gone to art school myself, and it's always this like odd thing where you're trying to like teach something or learn something that seems fundamentally like absurd to teach or to learn. So and every now and then you come across the idea of like rules or like objective qualities, like do they exist, do they not exist? I don't know if they do, but in this book the author was very clear, yeah, they do exist. So if you make a composition that's centered, it's just not good because there's no tension, so don't do it. And that's his diagram. So it's like, imagine this is your surface, you put something bang in the middle, not good. But if you put it like slightly off center, it's good because it's more tension, it's more interesting. So like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So I reproduced it on a larger scale. And I think what was kind of odd about it was that it's a centered composition, so it's not good. So it's sort of like the painting tells you it's not good. It also tells you that this is not good because it's centered, and all of them are centered compositions, right? And I also like, like in a way, I was just like, oh, I guess it's kind of right. Like this sort of like really. But then on the other hand, I was also like, but it's beautiful if you paint this way. It's fun. It's exciting. So there's also something about that, and not that you have to agree with like this is beautiful, but like. I felt that way when I was painting this painting, that it was just like really satisfying and great to give myself this arena to work like this. And I mean, it would be nice if there were rules in art that help you at times, but like for every rule, like there's the opposite, like there's a contradiction in it too. So it's like, yeah, okay, I mean, I can make a painting that is a central composition, and I don't know, I think it works as a painting. So in a way, it's sort of like, it gives you like vertigo, like every time you think you've got something, like it escapes you. It's like, you just continually keep trying to like make work that you think is worthwhile. But it's like a new every time it's a new struggle, because like whatever like you're only as good as your last painting, really. And yeah, so this is sort of a little bit about that. Do you want me to read the poem again?
Mhm.
All right. So, okay, so for you guys, this is these are instructions for how to live when things are going badly. Okay. So it's by Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet, who wrote it in 1948 during a lengthy prison stint. It's in 3 parts. Part 1: living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness, like a squirrel, for example. I mean, without looking for something beyond and above living. I mean, living must be your whole occupation. Living is no laughing matter. You must take it seriously, so much so and to such a degree that, for example, your hands tied behind your back to the wall, or else in a laboratory in your white coat and safety glasses, you can die for people. Even for people whose faces you've never seen, even though you know living is the most real, the most beautiful thing. I mean, you must take living so seriously that even at 70, for example, you'll plant olive trees. And not for your children either, but because although you fear death, you don't believe it. Because living, I mean, means heavier. Part 2. Let's say we're seriously ill, need surgery, which is to say we might not get up from the white table. Even though it's impossible not to feel sad about going a little too soon, we'll still laugh at the jokes being told. We'll look out the window to see if it's raining, or still wait anxiously for the latest newscast. Let's say we're at the front for something worth fighting for, say. There in the first offensive on that very day, we might fall on our face dead. We'll notice with a curious anger, but we'll still worry ourselves to death about the outcome of the war, which could last years. Let's say we're in prison and close to 50 and we have 18 more years, say. Before the iron doors will open, we'll still live with the outside, with its people and animals, struggle and wind. I mean, with the outside beyond the walls. I mean, however and wherever we are, we must live as if we will never die. Part 3. This earth will grow cold, a star among stars, and one of the smallest, a gilded mote on blue velvet. I mean, this, our great earth. This earth will grow cold one day, not like a block of ice or a dead cloud even, but like an empty walnut, it will roll along in pitch black space. You must grieve for this right now. You have to feel the sorrow now, for the world must be loved this much if you're going to say, I lived. So a couple of years after this poem, he was out of prison, but he was facing a prison sentence again, so he left for Moscow, and he died there, and yeah, his grave is still there.
What language is it written in? Is it written
Turkish.
in?
It was written in Turkish. Yeah, so this is a pretty good translation. Yeah.
Thank you, Ufuk.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Any last questions or yeah?
Yeah, I want to bring back to the ideas of composition there. Because I think maybe intentionally there is, if you started from the B in the good side, maybe there is, maybe it does accidentally adhere to a Fibonacci sequence from there coming out. And then bring that back to John Berger. I mean, from what I heard of you reading then, that was maybe one of his more flowery texts, more descriptive texts, as opposed to sort of like, well, academic, compositionally concerned things like ways of seeing, for example. In which he does say things like, well, you know, within the context of Western cultures and things like this is what's considered a standard, or is it? To that extent, he does go on to mention in mosques and Islamic culture, the centering of patterns and things like that, and how they do eventually build up onto this sort of like spiral again, that sort of in a roundabout way becomes a not centered thing. I was just wondering, yeah, again, in terms of decision making.
Yeah. I'm not super familiar with Islamic patterning and decoration. Like certainly not to the extent that it could have been a conscious influence, but even subconscious. Like I think I've been to a mosque once in my life, and that was with my German ethics class. So I mean, you know, there's I think with regards to this text, like what I found really, and I think you mentioned this, like it's really like transports you there very clearly, right? And it's not like pretty, but it's really believable. Like I feel like I've walked on that road and I've seen, and I've not been to Serbia, but you know, Turkey or Greece, whatever. Like I can sort of imagine. I can imagine what it was like, the dustiness, the crappiness of the concrete and yeah. So
Kind of like traveling on a train in Canada sometimes, when you're going and going and going.
yeah.
I think that's very, really exciting.
Yeah. There's one thing about this line in the poem about the olive trees. I just remembered I spent a couple months in Greece, and this person there told me about her dad who used to plant olive trees, and she was saying he planted thousands, and I'm not exaggerating. I literally mean thousands of like trees, because apparently that's in Greece. That's just what you do. It's like, and that's why you have lemon trees and olive trees like growing like kind of all over the place, and that it just becomes like a normal part of. And because if everyone does it, there's always like new trees there for people to like harvest, right? And I think the idea of like, yeah, you'll plant trees, but not for your children. You just do it for yourself, even if at that point the tree might outlive you. It doesn't matter, right? You just do it anyway. And there's a kind of like stubbornness to that is really, I mean, yeah, don't believe in that. Like that's really the whole point of this poem, right? Is that it's
And the way you talked about the repetition, like, yeah, I just kind of saw it in got a bunch of series and how the houses are the same, but not the same. They're drab, but yeah, that's what the connection I was drawing.
yeah. Well.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I wish we're so close to being able to chat around and have a glass of wine, but we're not quite there. But if anyone needs a sparkling water or anything before they hit the road, and yeah, don't rush away. I'll say goodbye to everyone here on Zoom. Thanks for coming.